Yeah, I thought we'd just watch a movie. Actually, this is about fugitive inks. What exactly is fugitive color? Fugitive color, of course, is color that tends to disappear after a stamp has been soaked. The whole idea of printing or dyeing or painting something, 99.9% of the time, is that you want what you've accomplished to stay there. But so the one that's talked about most is aniline ink. The name comes from the Portuguese for indigo. Here's the chemical formula. It means nothing to me. But the thing about aniline ink is that the dye, the pigment, is put into a solution, and that is used to print the stamp. But if you dip that stamp in certain other chemicals, the printing will begin to disappear. As I said before, normally you wouldn't want that to happen to anything you've printed or dyed. But with stamps, it was one way of preventing reuse. This is a famous example of it, New Zealand, where this stamp was intentionally printed in aniline ink, and you see what happens to it. Even if it gets damp, you can begin to see the pattern come through on the back. Just imagine if you actually really soaked it, it might all, in fact, disappear. And this is the first issue for New Zealand with the universal penny post for the British Commonwealth. Belgium used aniline inks off and on in its stamps for the same purpose, to prevent the reuse of them. On this sheet from the collection, you can see that this stamp to the left, this one in the middle, and this one to the right are all the same stamp, but they are different colors due to factors that happened most likely in the printing or maybe after they began to fade. Also, sunlight will fade stamps. These three stamps that I circled, all in Scott, get the same catalog number. There are apparently so many varieties and shades of these issues from Belgium back in the late 19th century that the catalogs just threw up their hands and said, let people.
It isn't really a shade, though. It's actually a damaged stamp.
Well, I can't verify that. I don't know if it was printed to a different mixture of ink. I haven't got enough of them, so I really don't know.
Roger?
Yes.
Are those blue stamps printed in aniline ink?
Yeah, that's what I can't be sure of. I was just going to say, and I'm glad you brought this up, Belgium printed these stamps at various times, and the same design and denomination would sometimes be printed with aniline ink and sometimes with color fast ink. So you really don't know. You'd have to take the stamp to see what you can do with it, manipulate it somehow.
You could look at the back and see whether the ink has soaked through.
If it has already, yeah, but you can't predict the future. There's probably some way of doing it with lighting, ultraviolet light or something like that. I'm sure that the two inks have different characteristics. Well, what happens with these stamps when you soak them is it's sort of unpredictable which color dye will begin to be dissolved and what you'll end up with. The catalogs often point out that the colors green and purple were the first inks that were aniline, the first ones to be used on postage. But it's my experience that the other colors too, for instance, that red from New Zealand. This is an example of stamps that are quite faded on the right as compared to the one on the left. I can't say this is because they used ink that tends to be fugitive, because the stamp to the left is an engraved stamp. The others are all surface printed, that is to say, not intaglio. So, and engraved stamps almost always will come out much sharper than lithographed or typographed stamps. This is the only stamp from Canada that is listed in Unitrade as having been printed with color-fast ink and aniline ink. This one would appear to be in color-fast ink, and it's, of course, a beautiful engraving, absolutely stunning in detail. But this is the only one they mention. The literature, however, points out that many other stamps were also printed in Canada with aniline or fugitive ink. But Unitrade is only lists this one. The most notorious of the stamps that were printed with fugitive ink, and this was on purpose, is the set here from 1880s in Great Britain. These stamps, to some degree, are all somewhat faded, particularly the green. And this was done on purpose. De La Rue, in fact, it's pointed out in one of the catalogs that De La Rue went to the government and proposed to do it this way as a way of just having the stamps be destroyed if they were soaked off and there was an attempt made to reuse them. And so they talked about these stamps being printed with double fugitive ink. I don't, it sounds like Animal House was super secret.
Probation.
Yeah, right, thank you. This is the note from Scott. I won't read the whole thing, but the last paragraph, values are for stamps with good color. Faded stamps will sell for much less. And it warns you about soaking. Stanley Gibbons goes much further. If they are faded, they are, quote, virtually worthless. That really stings. I looked at a page that I had put together. Oh boy, I got a couple $100. Well, who knows? It might be I have 12 cents. I can't be sure.
Most copies of these are faded, so.
Yes, yes, exactly. And De La Rue went on to print for another roughly 20 years, intermittently. They were printing British stamps. And in fact, I know they were printing the British stamps in 1907. You can see that this stamp to the left was used in 1907. The green to me looks somewhat blurred, but it doesn't look particularly faded. And the other stamp I would call both blurred and faded. Can't be sure that it's by De La Rue because I don't have a dated cancellation on it. But
Is that is that right-hand stamp a canceled stamp, or is it unused?
it has no gum. Let's put it that way. I don't know. I imagine very much that it was used.
Yeah.
That's a pretty high value stamp that would get a package going, and it looks like it's been soaked. Interestingly enough, you could soak some of these things in certain chemicals. I guess that's quite understandable, and it will not fade, but if you put it in water, it will. Well, different liquids have different chemical properties. So this is a question of judgment here, and I use the Latin quis judicat, and that is, who's to say how faded it is? I guess you would need some standard, and that would probably be an unused copy. But even then, since they were printed by different companies, you couldn't be sure. You'd have to do an awful lot of analysis. But these two stamps clearly are faded. And the other Latin that I use is caveat emptor, buyer beware. And here's why. I didn't take my own advice. I went to a stamp store and I bought the stamp on the right because it's a really nice copy. However, every place I look, I see it's supposed to be green, not blue. So I have purchased at well over $200, well over $300 this stamp because I wanted to complete a set. And what I did is I got a faded stamp that has clearly been soaked. I commented at the place, I said, this doesn't look exactly the same color. And the person selling it said, yeah, it's slightly different. I went ahead with